We've outlined the case against the White House's prosecution of whistleblowers. Now we speak with someone who offers an articulate argument from the opposing side. Matthew Miller was the Director of Public Affairs at the Department of Justice. He served as Attorney General Eric Holder's spokesperson during President Obama's first 2 years in office. Last year, he wrote a piece defending the administration's approach to those who leak classified information. He said, "It is easy to understand why the press resists leak prosecutions so strenuously. Reporters' jobs depend on unearthing government secrets, and they often make our nation stronger by doing so. But some things are secret for a reason. And when government employees violate the law to disclose information that undermines our national security, there must be consequences." He spoke to us from our bureau in Washington. The last time we had you on this program, we discussed the Manning case, the WikiLeaks phenomenon, the Thomas Drake case at the NSA, other prosecutions that were taking place under the Espionage Act. You had just written a piece defending the administration's approach. Since then, we've seen the Department of Justice gathering surveillance information on the Associated Press, investigating Fox. We've seen New York Times reporter James Risen called to testify on his sources. Now Edward Snowden on the run from American justice. Are you still a backer of the administration's approach on these issues?
Absolutely, and I think you have to separate. There are a couple of different issues that get entwined here. One is the prosecution of national security officials who took an oath to protect classified information and broke that oath and broke the law. And when that happens, the government prosecutes them, and I think they're well within their rights to do so. And then there are more complicated questions about the freedom of the press that are raised when the government subpoenas journalist records and subpoenas either emails or phone records. And that's a much more difficult question. It raises all kinds of constitutional questions here. And I think the government did get a little out of balance in the way they approached those issues, and they've acknowledged that and put some reforms into place to address them.
Well, oaths matter, but this administration, like many before it, leaks like a sieve. There are leaks coming out of there on security matters all the time. They were leaking material that was classified at a higher level than anything that Bradley Manning or Edward Snowden leaked. So what about that double standard?
Some of the stuff that Snowden leaked was very serious and potentially very harmful to national security. But that being said, there are too many leaks in the government. There are leaks that shouldn't happen. They happen all the time, some authorized, some unauthorized. And it does make it tough for the people where I used to work, the Justice Department that's in charge of prosecuting people for these. It makes it tough to decide when to go after them.
So if you think that the prosecution of Edward Snowden is justified, do you feel the same way about Glenn Greenwald, the reporter at The Guardian, who was the conduit for that information? Because he is, to the Snowden story, what Julian Assange was to the Manning story, wasn't he?
Yes, and no, I don't think he should be prosecuted. I don't think he ever will be prosecuted. In fact, the Attorney General has said that as long as he's Attorney General, no journalist will be prosecuted for doing their job. Now, you do get into sticky questions about who is a journalist. Glenn Greenwald, of course, is. There are questions about whether Assange really is. But even aside from those questions, I think it's very hard to see someone being prosecuted for soliciting information, for publishing information.
Back to the Manning case for a minute. The military court at Fort Meade found Manning guilty on multiple charges. However, the judge did throw out testimony from the State Department officials who said that the leaked cables harmed U.S. diplomatic efforts. And the judge also acquitted Manning on that aiding the enemy charge. Pentagon officials who initially went on the record to say that what Manning revealed would endanger American lives overseas or the lives of American allies have since said that nobody came to any harm over those leaks. So what damage did Bradley Manning actually do?
I always question this argument because, we have laws. If you commit a crime, you are prosecuted for committing that crime, whether or not anyone is harmed or not. If you get pulled over for drunk driving, just because you didn't wreck your car into a schoolyard and kill 10 children, you're still prosecuted for driving drunk because it's reckless and you could have harmed someone. So just because no one was harmed doesn't mean someone couldn't have been harmed, and it also doesn't mean that one individual has the right to unilaterally decide what should and should not be public for the entire government. There are checks and balances in place to make those decisions, and it's just not appropriate for one individual to do that on their own.
Then there's the overall trend of the growth in secrecy in government, particularly in Washington. According to the NSA, in 2002, a little more than 11 million documents were classified. By 2009, that figure was up to 54 million. It's since grown. The U.S. government, it seems, has more and more secrets. Is that not part of the bigger picture here, the bigger problem?
It is a huge part of the bigger problem. The amount of secrecy since 2001 has grown. You know, the national security apparatus since 2001 has grown. We've invested a lot more money in national security, both abroad and at home. And with that has come an increase in secrets, but it's out of hand. It's something that really needs to be dealt with in a more serious way than has been to date.
The bottom line on this administration when it comes to the protection of whistleblowers is that if a whistleblower reveals illegality or wrongdoing at a department like the Food and Drug Administration, which affects people, the government will protect that whistleblower. But anything on national security is where the administration draws the line. Are you, as an American, comfortable with that?
I think you have to differentiate between what's wrongdoing and what's controversial, because what's controversial isn't always necessarily wrong. So Edward Snowden might not agree with those programs, but the elected representatives of the United States government in all three branches have, and they've blessed them repeatedly. So while they may be controversial, and I think that that it's a worthy discussion to have, that doesn't mean there's actually any wrongdoing coming here. And it goes back to my point that it's why it's not appropriate for one individual by themselves to make a decision that has such far-reaching implications across the government and across the country.
So the approach is you're going to have to trust us on national security. That's what Washington is telling Americans. But if you go back to the Vietnam days, had Daniel Ellsberg not leaked the Pentagon Papers, had Americans had to trust General Westmoreland or their Secretary of Defense at the time who were telling them that the war was going swimmingly, U.S. soldiers might still be in Vietnam. You know, the American people trusted their national security officials in 2001 and 2002 and 2003 on the run-up to the Iraq War, on weapons of mass destruction, on Saddam's imaginary non-existent links to al-Qaeda. Isn't trusting the government one of the problems that has led to America getting into these foreign quagmires in the first place?
There is always a tension here in these areas, and that's why we have a free press in this country. It's why we have journalists who aggressively cover the government, who ask questions all the time, and aren't shy about revealing what they believe to be wrongdoing or what they believe to be controversial, whether it's actually wrong or not. So,
but those journalists, sorry to interrupt, but those journalists need sources. And under the current environment, the chill, those sources are drying up.
Look, if you read the papers here every day, you see tough journalism holding the administration, holding both parties accountable. I hear this from journalists that there's been a chill in reporting, but you still see tough national security reporting happening all the time. Good journalists are always going to find a way to reveal information. Look, I take your point. There is always a tension here, and it's tough to know, and you have to ask it in every situation when the right time is for a secret to become public. And in a situation like with Edward Snowden, I think there are a lot of us who have worked in the government who say it's very hard to understand why one individual takes on themselves this massive authority to publish programs that have really, in the government's mind, done a lot to keep the American people safe.
Well, possibly because some of those people feel that their conscience dictates that they do those things. People have said of Snowden that going up the chain of command is what he should have done. He shouldn't have gone outside, shouldn't have gone to the Guardian, should have gone to his superiors and said, hey, there's a problem here, and let's talk about it. But people like Thomas Drake at the National Security Agency, the very same agency that Snowden was at, say that they tried to go up the chain of command. They brought their concerns about illegality, about waste, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of taxpayers' money being wasted, and that you couldn't get a hearing, or those people were invested in the programs that someone like Drake and now Snowden, were interested in discussing. Is that not the case? Is that not the real problem, that the internal chain of command, let's climb up and discuss it inside, that doesn't work? That's why you've got to go outside to the media.
You do have to go outside sometimes, but there are avenues to do that without going up the chain of command. There's an inspector general at every agency that operates independent of the chain of command who you can bring concerns to. There are oversight committees in Congress who you can bring concerns to as a whistleblower. So yes, it's always very hard to bring things to the chain of command, but if whistleblowers do have real evidence of government wrongdoing, there are avenues to bring them to without going public. And I would say that when whistleblowers have brought public cases of wrongdoing in the past, and Tom Tam, the last administration, blowing the whistle on warrantless wiretapping, they often aren't prosecuted for those acts.
What about the media side of this story? Some people who know Snowden, they were asked, why didn't he take this story to the New York Times? And what they said is that Snowden was aware of what happened in 2004 when the Times had a story on warrantless wiretapping under the Bush administration. The administration asked the newspaper to hold that story off for reasons of national security. The Times held the story off until 2005, after President Bush was reelected. And what Snowden's friends are saying is that he didn't trust the Times, and he felt he had to take this story to an organization that's headquartered outside the U.S., The Guardian, to get it out into the news. And it's not something that Daniel Ellsberg ever had to do back in the day, but I'm wondering whether you, just as an American consumer of news, are at all troubled when you hear stories like that about, you know, the newspaper that is supposed to publish all the news that's fit to print.
Let me speak to it as a former government official who's dealt with the New York Times on a number of things. I have never seen the New York Times willing to pull a punch on any administration unless they really believed there was a strong claim that it could hurt national security. And when I was at the Justice Department, there were a couple times I went to the New York Times and asked them to delay publishing something for a short period of time while an operation was underway. And they agreed because there was real harm that could benefit, and that's accountable journalism, and that's where sometimes governments and journalists can work together responsibly. But I think the idea that the Times would look to protect anyone in the government because of their reputation or because of the access they need to officials is ludicrous. I mean, that's just not how they operate there. They're tough, and they hold everyone they cover accountable.
Matt Miller, formerly of the U.S. Department of Justice, thanks for speaking to us today.
Thanks for having me.